Okay, hey, it's Michael. That was an abrupt transition, but here we are. Here tonight with Mark O'Connell, who is a writer of some renown and working on a lot of new and exciting things that he'll also be talking about. In addition to talking about his history as a writer on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And with me to help in that process is my old pal Lance Miller, who comes as an expert in Trek and also writing, and they are amongst us right now. You guys are live. How you doing?
I'm good. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I want to hear how Mark got into this because it's not something everybody sets out to do.
Yeah.
So I bet you didn't. I bet that wasn't your plan.
Well, that's such a great lead into a story. When I was in high school in Waukesha, um, I had an English teacher who was who I really admired. He was a good mentor for me and a good friend. And I just remember one day in high school, I was in study hall, and he was the study hall monitor. And out of the blue, he just said, "O'Connell, what are you going to be when you grow up?" And I said, "Well," and my honest answer was, "Well," I said at the time, I either want to be a car designer or I want to write movies." And my teacher thought for a second, and he said, "Write movies." So that's pretty much what decided it. so,
The one
so
time that a counselor was right. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, he was spot on. I have to say, it was great advice, and so I followed it ever since. Never regretted it. And but instead of writing movies, as you know, I got my first break actually writing TV.
So what's the gap between school and that first big sort of noteworthy job? And was there anything in between?
Very little in between. I went to University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, got a film theory degree there, not production, um, and then got married and started a family real young. So that really took up a lot of my time and attention for the next few years. But around right around the time I turned 30, I got my first agent. I had been sending out query letters to literary agencies that I found in the back of Writer's Digest magazine, and got lucky with one of them. One of the agents wrote back and said, "Sure, I'd love to read your stuff. Let me see something." So I sent her out a copy of it was a spec script for Home Improvement, and which was a big hit at the time, and it was interesting. So she took me on as a client, and the first thing she said to me after we became professionally involved, first thing she said to me was, "You know what? Mark, you should write for Star Trek: The Next Generation." And I said, "Well, you read me pretty well. I think I think I love science fiction. Always have. I think that's a great idea." The irony of it was, so at the time, Star Trek: Next Generation was in production, and the the producers of Star Trek: The Next Generation had this amazing open door policy where they recognized how passionate and how massive their fan base was, and so they opened the door to script submissions from anybody, whether they had ever sold a script before, whether they were represented by an agent or not, didn't matter. Anybody who sent them in a spec script, that script would be read by one of the production staff, and they would get back to you. So the irony of it is, I had a brand new agent, but I didn't even really need the agent
Yeah.
because Star Trek would have read the script regardless. But I thought it was great advice, so I spent some time writing a teleplay for a Star Trek: The Next Generation episode. And first tip to your students: learn the format. I didn't really know the script format when I was doing that, and of course, this was way before Final Draft. You had to do all the indentation and layout by hand, manually, the hard way. And I did a very bad job of it. I sent them in a script that was like 20 pages too long and formatted awfully. I didn't know that at the time. So my agent submitted that script, and then I waited and waited, and then I got panicky because I went months and months. I think it was something like 9 months without hearing boo from my agent. Turned out she had been in a horrible car accident, and I'm not making this up. She had been in a coma for months and months and months. So all this time I'm sitting, I'm sitting here in
Oh,
Wisconsin thinking, why am I not hearing from my agent? What's going on here? She was actually in a coma in a hospital. So, so I'm happy to say she survived, and we're still good friends. She doesn't represent me anymore, but she's still around. That's the important part.
that's
She
good.
came
Yeah.
she came out of the coma. Um,
I suppose that's a testament to the availability of social media now. You would have known a lot sooner. Um,
that's true. That's true.
everything moves a lot faster now.
So Wendy recovers and she's back on the job, and she contacts the producers at Star Trek, and they say, "Oh yeah, we've been trying to get a hold of you. We really like the script that your client wrote, um, and we'd like to invite him in to pitch stories." So that's how it all began. And thankfully, the producers at Star Trek didn't lose patience after not being able to get a hold of my comatose agent for months and months. So that's how I got my first shot at it.
So remind me about the timeline. Was the open door policy a Gene Roddenberry thing, or was that
No, that
post
was more of
Gene?
a Michael Piller. That was
Okay.
more of a Michael Piller and Rick Berman thing.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't think that I don't know for sure. I could be wrong on this, but I think that policy wasn't in place when Gene was still running thing. But he was gone after like the first two seasons of
First
Next
Gene,
Generation,
right?
and this would have already been like season 4 or 5 by the time I was writing my spec for them.
It seems really unusual that industry would have any kind of open door policy
Oh
for
yeah,
content, but that would be the program to do it on, I would think,
yeah.
because of their sort of open mindedness. Were you living in Los Angeles for that?
No, I was living here in Wisconsin.
Hmm.
I had lived in Wisconsin a couple of times for a couple of brief stints in my early 20s. I was out there for maybe 2.5 years in total, lived out there, and I discovered something very strange. I was so busy. I was so busy supporting myself and just enjoying being in California that I wasn't writing anything. And one day I thought, well, this is dumb. The whole point of being out here is to try to establish myself as a scriptwriter, and I'm not doing that at all. Um, so I ended up moving back to Wisconsin, and yeah, so I ended up doing all of my Star Trek pitching from here. And in fact, I learned much later that the Star Trek producers had a nickname for a lot of people who they would call in to pitch would fly out to LA for the pitch. I chose not to. I just stayed at home and did it at my kitchen table. But the producers, the guys who flew out there all the time to do pitches, the producers called them frequent flyers. So I was not a frequent flyer. I did it all from my home in Wisconsin. And what happened was, um, so here's how they set it up. So I'm invited in to pitch, and they give me they give me a list of here's how it's going to work. They said you can pitch up to 4 story ideas, um, and if we love one of them, great. We'll see what we can do with it. And if we pass on all your story ideas, that's it. That's your only chance, um, because there are so many other people in line behind you that we have to be strict about that. If you don't sell a script, then that's it. You're done. So with that in mind, I spent a couple of months coming up with 4 pitches. Of course, if they allowed 4, I was going to go for 4. Um, and I'll still remember this. I pitched to a producer named Joe Manoski. He's a very nice guy. And this is for Star Trek Next Generation. Um, so I'm pitching stories for Next Generation. And I pitched all 4 stories, and one by one, Joe swatted them down and said, no, we can't do that. He's like, yeah, it's a nice idea, but we're already doing something similar to that. Or, oh, we did something kind of like that last season. Or, there was always some reason why he was like, I like your idea, but we can't use it for whatever reason. And that happened with all 4 of my pitches. So at the end, I just thought, well, that's it. I had my one shot, and it's over. But then Joe stayed on the phone, and he started saying, now here's what I want you to do next time, Mark. And I stopped him. I said, excuse me, what are you talking about? What do you mean, what next time? I thought I only got one shot. And he said, well, normally that's the rule. But he said, I actually really like your ideas, and I want you to come back and try again. So he gave me some pointers. Next time try to do a little more of this, a little less of that. And I was just like, okay, if you're inviting me back, I'm coming back.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So over the course of it was a very long time. It was close to 2 years. I kept going back and pitching to Next Generation, and I kept on bombing with my it was always 4 stories every time, but I kept bombing, but they kept inviting me back. And I just told them, look, you're never going to get rid of me this way. If you keep inviting me back, I'm coming. So over and over again, I'd pitch 4 stories and they'd all get swatted down. Then finally, on about the sixth or seventh try, over about 2 years, I pitched 4 stories to oh gosh, who was it? I think it was Brandon Braga. So I pitched 4 stories to him, and he really liked one of them. And he said, I like this idea. I'm going to take this one upstairs. Well, I had heard this before. I'd had ideas make it past the pitch and be taken upstairs to the writer's room for evaluation, but they always ended up passing on them. So this time he says, well, I'm going to take this upstairs. So, sit tight, you'll hear from me. So I didn't hear from him for about 2 weeks, and I was starting to think, well, that probably means he passed on, somebody said no to my idea. Well, then out of the blue, after about 2 weeks, I get a phone call from Brandon saying, Mark, I really need to ask a huge favor of you. He said, our executive producer, meaning Michael Pillar, he said, our executive producer just threw out a script that has to go into production in 4 days. And he said, we really love your idea and we want to use it, but there's a catch. He said, there's no way we would ever put a freelance writer in a position where we would ask them to write a script in over a weekend, literally. He said, that just wouldn't be fair to you. That's something we have to do in-house. So he said, if you will sell us your story concept and let us write the script, then he said, I promise you'll get a better break next time around. So, so of course I said yes. So essentially they bought, for that sale for the Next Generation, they bought a pitch line. They bought one sentence.
Nice.
And the pitch line described basically, I should have kept that pitch line somewhere. I don't have it. I still have a copy of that first check I got for it, but I didn't keep the pitch line itself. But it was something along the lines of Captain Picard and a couple of his crewmates are returning to the spaceship Enterprise on a shuttlecraft, returning from an away mission. And when they arrive at their coordinates to rendezvous with the Enterprise, they find that it is locked in battle with a Romulan spaceship. But both spaceships are frozen in time. They're in suspended animation. The trouble is, they froze in time just as the Romulan ship was firing a lethal blow to the Enterprise. So our heroes have to come up with a way to get time running again, knowing that the minute time starts running again, the Enterprise will be destroyed.
Beautiful.
So it was just a puzzle story, right? So so I sold that to them for the grand total of $1,750 for the story concept. The downside was I didn't get any screen credit for that because there is no screen credit for story concept by. There's written by, there's story by and written by, but there's no, this guy wrote one sentence title, officially. So I didn't get a title, but Brannon wrote this really fun script out of my idea. The episode is called Timescape. And he just took the puzzle element and just ratcheted it up to an incredible degree. So the characters said they didn't have just like one problem to solve. They had like 16 problems to solve before they could save their ship and their crewmates. And I was pretty amazed at the job he did with my scant little story.
Well, it's a great story seed. I mean, you could see that one working in the old series too. You can just imagine that version of it. Lance, I don't want to take the entirety of questions. Do you have questions before we get into that Deep Space Nine section of it? Because
that's probably a good segue. I was sort of curious about. So did you eventually go to Los Angeles? Did you eventually sit in the writer's room and how they break down the stories? So when you eventually got hired to write for Deep Space Nine, what was sort of the process?
Well, about 6 weeks after I sold the pitch line, the story concept for Timescape to Next Generation, I was pitching for Deep Space Nine, and DS9 was just were just ramping up production, okay, on Deep Space Nine at this time. So I was one of the first batch of writers who was invited into pitch. So, and I'm pretty sure it was my first time pitching to Deep Space Nine that I got a hit. And it started out the same way. They said, "I love the story idea. I'm going to take it upstairs and see what the other guys think." And this time they said, "We love the story. We want to do the episode. We're going to hire you to do the story." So the process is, first of all, if they want to do the pitch, then they hire you to write the story, which means that you take your pitch, which is, maybe a page and a half long, and they want you to turn that into a very fleshed out story treatment, complete 4 acts, tag, teaser. I can't remember what all they had. And you have maybe a week's time to write the story treatment, and the story treatment ends up being 7, 8, maybe 9 pages long. And you cover the A story and the B story, but there's no dialogue, or very, very little dialogue, just basically all the story beats. And what you're doing in this process is they love your pitch, but in this step, when you're writing the story treatment, your job is to prove to them that there is an hour's worth of entertainment here. You want to prove to them that there's a good enough story that you can write 45 pages of it, and it'll all hold together. So I wrote the story. Now, this first one was called Second Sight, and this episode, the story I pitched, was based on the fact that Commander Sisko, the commander of the space station, was a widower and had been single for several years in their storyline. So I pitched a story where Sisko meets a woman on the space station who he falls in love with, except she keeps disappearing. He turns his back on her for 1 second and she's gone. So they bought that pitch. They hired me to write the story. They loved the story. And then after that, they hired me to write the script. So writing the story and writing the script are 2 separate steps. So writing the story, I did again at my home office / kitchen table here in Wisconsin. But when they hired me to write the script, then I flew out to LA. I had to pay for it. They don't cover the cost for that because they figure, hey, it's not our fault you live in Wisconsin, which is kind of jerky, but I guess I understand from their point of view. But yeah, so from there on, whenever I would do a full episode where I was writing, I would go out and spend 2, 3, maybe 4 days in the writer's room with the staff, hammering out the beat outline. And so that's where you really have to collaborate. You have to be in a collaborative mindset because you're sitting in a room with 3, 4, 5 other people who know this show inside and out because they've been living and breathing it for years. So you basically spend the first day or so being very quiet and very cautious about shouting out ideas and stuff, and by the second and third day you feel my experience anyway was I felt comfortable enough and welcome enough that I could start throwing around ideas and suggesting little bits of dialogue here and there. So that's how that all went.
I would suppose that would probably feel like a bit of a safety net, knowing that nobody knows these shows better than them.
Yeah.
And that you're in great hands, and you're just there to make sure that whatever seed of your idea makes it through that process. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, I just because I'm just sort of curious as to if you have any other tips as to how to navigate the writer's room and keep yourself focused and how to collaborate and just sort of maybe some tips on making that process work. Because in your situation, you were going into where it was really well established. But if you were starting from scratch, that would be kind of a different situation.
Well, my biggest advice for what you're asking about is you just have to be willing to let go of things. That's the most important thing. You have to be willing to let go of things that sooner or later there's going to be some line of dialogue that you absolutely love that's going to get cut. There's going to be a scene that you think is just essential to your story that's going to get cut. So you just have to go in. You've probably heard the term "kill your darlings." you basically have to be ready to kill your darlings once you get into the writer's room. And if you're not willing to do that, it's not going to go very well. Because even if you don't like, even if you're in a situation where you don't like the way the story is going with the staff, that doesn't really matter. You just have to
Right.
roll with it. You have to roll with it. And I'll have a story later on about one particular instance where that worked. But so this was my my first professional script sale. So I was able to just keep reminding myself. Here's the big thing for me. Going into something like this, going into this meeting, this story meeting for the first time, it can be really nerve-wracking. You don't know if you're good enough. You don't know if you're going to freeze up once you're in the room with them. But I learned this little trick that I used every time, and it always worked for me. I would just, before I went into the appointment or the meeting or the session, I would just stop myself and think, remember, they invited you here. They invited you here because they like your work and they want to hear your ideas because they think your ideas are cool. So once I learned that trick of telling myself that, I would just do that every time before I entered the writer's room, and it really did the trick for me. I was able to relax and just feel like I'm free to contribute. I'm free to throw out whatever idea pops into my head, and just see what happens. Some of them they like, and they end up on the big end up on the big whiteboard, and some of them don't. But it's all part of the process.
Was that a boys' club, that writers' room?
Yeah, I think there's always an intern. I think the intern may have been a woman. Gosh, I'm really foggy on that now. It's been a while.
I asked because it's a rather soapy show, so
Yeah.
they would probably want to keep an ear to that voice in there. I have a
It's
question
pretty
from
male.
Mackenzie. Is
Hi,
someone
Mackenzie.
writing the script during the writers' room session, or is it coming up with a plan and having someone else write out that official script later?
That's a really good question. What we do in those story meetings is we put together what they call a beat sheet. And what that is so I've already written the story treatment. As I said, that's about a 7 or 8 page document that just basically describes beginning, middle, and end of the story. So the next step is the beat sheet, and that's what we work on in the writer's room. And that's basically and this is where the intern comes in. The intern is standing up at this dry erase board with a marker, and it's teaser. We start out with teaser. Okay, where does the teaser take place? Who is in the teaser? What are they talking about? What are they doing? What's driving whatever's happening? And that's basically what the intern puts up on the board. There's nothing flowery about it. There's no flowery description of anything. There's no dialogue. Again, it's just who's in the shot, or who's in the scene, not the shot, the scene. Who's in the scene? What are they talking about? What's going on? How does this move the storyline forward? So you do that for the teaser. Then you do act one. And act one is probably, in any given act, there's probably going to be at least 4, maybe up to 8 or 9 scenes in each act. And each scene is handled separately. Again, the intern will put up, act one, scene one. Where is it taking place? Who is present in the scene? What are they talking about? What are they doing? How's it moving the story forward? So you just work that out. And believe it or not, that whole process for a 4-act TV drama could sometimes take, 4 days. I think maybe I was even on one of them where we worked 5 days. But that's all that happens at that stage. Then when that's all done, the intern types it all up, everybody gets a copy, and then they send me home to Wisconsin and say, okay, buddy, you got 2 weeks to write a script.
Wow.
So, which isn't as hard as it seems, because what I found was, even though I'd be going home and starting the script from scratch, technically, I would have been spending that whole time in the writer's room thinking about, how am I going to tell this story? What dialogue can I write here? So when I did get home and start working on the actual script, I already had lots and lots of ideas ready to write. I had lots and lots of little scraps of dialogue floating around in my head, and it was all there for me to just start typing it out. So the 2-week deadline actually turned out to be, really not that bad.
A little
Plus,
spacious.
yeah, but the big thing about it though is that beat out line. I had never heard of a beat out line before I started working for them. I had never heard of it. Well, remember, my degree was in film theory, not film production. So I had no idea. But what I discovered was when you're writing a script based on a beat sheet, it's so easy. It's so much easier than you can imagine because all the hard decisions have already been made. All the crucial decisions about how to tell this story, how to keep the audience hooked, those decisions have already been thought through by the entire writer staff, and they're laid out on this beat sheet. So I've got this perfect foundation for a script. I don't have to spend any time worrying about, okay, what should the next scene be? Because I already have it on the beat sheet. I know what the next scene is going to be, and it makes it very easy to just focus on the scene you're writing, and then think about how it's going to fit in with the next scene and the scene after that. And it really makes the writing process kind of, it's weird to say, but it makes the writing process kind of easy.
Yeah, the hard work is done.
All the tough decisions have been made already.
I have a ton of other questions about that, but let's run the trailer. This is the preview that would be at the end of the previous episode for what's coming next week on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This one will be for Second Sight. You guys won't be able to see it, but the audience will. Here it is, Second Sight.
Cisco meets a mysterious woman.
Tell me all about yourself.
Who captures his heart.
I love you, Benjamin.
But where did she come from?
There is no record of anyone matching the description you gave me.
And what is she hiding?
I'm not reading any cellular structure.
Is she real?
I need answers, Dax.
What is the secret of her strange existence?
Commander, obviously you have mistaken me for someone else.
On the next episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Oh, that sounds like the 90s right there.
Is that like
Very
Don
energetic.
LaFontaine?
Might be. Yeah. Certainly the sequencer there tells us that we're in good hands on Deep Space Nine. So, beautiful, great. I mean, just a great period in TV. Was it all about dancing around those ad breaks since this is ad television?
Oh, yeah, it was. I just want to say one thing real quickly, though, before I forget.
Okay.
So you saw the coming attractions for Second Sight. The older man, the actor, the guest star, who I know he pops up a little bit in the trailer. I can't remember how much. So that's Richard Kiley, very famous Broadway star who also did a lot. He did a lot of movies and TV, but he was mostly known for his Broadway work. He starred in Man of La Mancha. I think he created that role, Man of La Mancha. Unbelievable voice. I mean, he's like Mr. Voiceover for a lot of things. I was so thrilled to have Richard Kiley. I mean, I was thrilled to have the cast of the show reading my dialogue, but to have Richard Kiley reading my dialogue, and the character he was doing was this really bombastic, egocentric scientist who just had a serious God complex because he invented the technology of terraforming planets. So that was kind of a cool way. If any of your students have watched any of the Star Trek original cast movies, in Star Trek II, The Search for Spock, they introduced this Genesis device, which is sort of a time bomb that'll completely recreate a planet and make it habitable. So I was able to tie into that Star Trek movie with my TV script by portraying this guy as the man who invented that Genesis one of the inventors of that Genesis technology. So that was kind of a kick. But the fact that they got Richard Kiley to do the part, and I know they were hoping to get Richard Harris, who also would have been a real kick. But so they, for whatever reason, they couldn't get Richard Harris, so they got Richard Kiley. And I didn't get a chance to meet him, but I was very thrilled with that. So what was your question again? I got completely sidetracked.
If I could interject, Mike
Sure.
was talking about working around the
commercial breaks. Yeah.
So there's a lot written about, and I'm sure that a lot of the people watching right now know a lot about the 3-act structure and what happens at what point in the script. But can you talk a little bit about working in, because I think DS9 had a teaser in 5 acts. So like, where do you put the elements? Do you worry about the midpoint? How does that work working in 5 acts as opposed to 3?
It's a kind of a strange process because you're still doing a 3-act story, but it's broken up into 5 acts. Um, so what you're so the best approximation, I guess, would be that the first act in a 60-minute script is the same as the first act in any script. It's the setup, it's the introduction of the setting and the characters and what's at stake for the characters. But then in the 3-act structure where you've got a second act in the 60-minute drama, you've got your second and third acts are your second act. So you sort of have second and third act, I would always find were kind of the hardest acts to write because you're sort of like you're in this constant tug of war because you're moving the story forward, but you can't let it move forward too quickly because you still have a lot of stuff you need to communicate before things get, really dicey at the end of the second act. So the third act then, the classic third act in a 60-minute script then becomes like the fourth and fifth act. So you essentially have a first act that's 8 to 10 pages. So if you consider each of the 60-minute script acts are about 8 to 10 pages, then you've got 8 to 10 pages for Act 1, you've got 16 to 20 pages for Act 2, and then the same for Act 3. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the best. That's the best I can describe it.
Yeah, that's great.
But it's hard to get your mind in that setting because you're always thinking. I can never get away from thinking 3-act structure. So to write a 5-act script and still have the story function as if it's a 3-act story was always kind of challenging for me.
Those were 60-page scripts?
No, they would generally be about 45, 50.
45, yeah. Minutes the page. It's a makeup show. It's very much a show about. How do you humanize in your scripts this dilemma of fantasy and science fiction? How important is that human element? Since your stories seemed to have been very human stories, right?
Yeah, I would say aside from Timescape, which was the most basically technological story for Next Generation, it was always a challenge because here's what I kept coming across. My way of humanizing a character is to give the character a moment of humor. And I think everybody can be funny now and then. Even if they're not naturally funny people, everybody can be funny now. Everybody has their moment, right? So I would try to sneak in just funny little moments for the different characters on Deep Space Nine. Nothing real major, nothing that would like intrude on the flow of the scene or anything that would jump out as, not really being appropriate. I would just find a way to sort of organically fit just a funny little moment in for one or two of the characters. Well, Deep Space Nine had a regular cast of 7 characters, and one of the characters was this alien named Quark who ran the bar on the space station. So I distinctly remember one script where I had given the guy in charge, Commander Sisko, I had given him a funny little moment. Can't remember what it was now. But I'd given him a funny little moment, and that got X'd out on my script, and the producers told me, no. Sisko would never say that. That's what Quark is for. Yeah. And that drove me nuts because it's like, okay, so there's only one character out of 7 who can do funny stuff on the show? You've got to be kidding me. So that became a constant frustration for me because it just went against the grain of what I thought was good writing. I thought there is no reason why the commander can't have a moment of humor. If you think back on the original Star Trek series, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy in the middle of the most dramatic storylines would have a moment or two of just hilarious comedy. And it worked because it was organic to the characters in this situation. It didn't detract from the characters at all. So it always really frustrated me that the producers of Deep Space Nine had that limitation on their characters. No, you can't have this person do something funny. But that became an inspiration to me. And we'll get to this later, but my last script I did for Deep Space Nine was an out-and-out comedy. So I actually got my revenge because I was able to give
Make everybody
I was able to give not all of the characters probably, but I was able to give most of the characters some funny bits in this script because it was, like I said, it was an out and out comedy. So I kind of beat them at their own game. I was very proud of that because um, Star Trek doing a comedy is a very, very rare thing. And normally, a rare thing like that, something that's special, normally that's a script that the show's producers are going to just hog to themselves because they want to have their name on the special script for the special episode, you know?
cool.
So the fact that not only did I sell a pitch that was a comedy script, but I got to write the script and I got sole writing credit for it. And it's a fan favorite. You guys might know the science fiction website, io9.com. A couple years ago, they had a science fiction writer rate the top 100 Trek episodes of all time,
yeah.
with every series that had ever been made and every movie that had ever been made. And that script of mine, my comedy script, Who Mourns for Morn, came in number 72 on the top 100 list. I'm Mr. 72.
cool.
I've always been very proud of that.
I got a whole bunch of short questions here, but let's really quick look at the trailer for Who Mourns for Morn.
His top customer just hit bottom.
Can't believe he's really gone.
Now, Quark's about to hit the jackpot.
He left everything to you.
Me?
But everyone wants a piece of the action.
It's all ours.
Don't try anything.
And his fortune is about to change.
Turn around.
For the worse on the next Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Interestingly, that trailer plays it pretty serious. They make it sound scary. So,
That was.
truth in
You're right.
advertising.
They did.
All
That was
right.
kind of funny.
Here's a couple shorties from the gang. Did you ever get to see the filming process and sit there and make script changes during production?
No, I never did because by the time the shows went into production, I was back here in Wisconsin, and so if I lived in LA, there probably would have been a slim chance, but nobody ever wants a writer on set. There are very good reasons. There are very good reasons why producers, directors, and actors do not want writers on script because if they see something happening that they didn't write, there's too much of a risk that the writer will go ballistic and just start, just making a scene and making a mess of things. So, no, I did not get to see any of the filming. I got to walk through some of the sets at one point, and at one point, this was a funny moment. I was in the office building one day, and I was looking for someone I needed to get some information from, and I went into an office to see if that person was there. And it was actually a casting meeting, and the director of the next episode, who happened to be Anson Williams, who was Potsy from the show Happy Days. So Anson Williams was directing the next episode of Deep Space Nine, and I walked in, and he's got the room full of actors and actresses, the guest actors who he's cast for his episode. And I barge into this office, and Anson Williams looks up at me. He's like, "Oh, did casting send you? Are you the guy who's going to play so-and-so?" And I was like, "Oh, no." And I left right away, but I've always regretted it. I know I should have said yes. I should have gotten a part as one of the guest aliens.
Wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
Aaron asks, what's the time frame between you doing the writer's room and the episode actually airing? Quick, right?
What's that?
Was it fairly quick?
Yeah, it was fairly quick. I would say no more than a month.
Yeah.
Every time. Their turnaround is really, really fast.
Was that a 22 episode season?
I think it was 26, but I'm not sure offhand.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm
it
not
was
sure.
it was 26 because it wasn't network, it was syndicated, so they had to fill 52 weeks a year.
Gotcha. Very good. Jason Thomas, my friend Jason, asks, what DS9 character resonated with you the most?
Chief O'Brien.
And
And I couldn't even tell you why. I just really liked the actor Cullum Meaney. I thought he brought a lot of really fun energy to the part. And that, being a chief engineer on a Star Trek show is intimidating because you've got Scotty from the original series as your model. And how do you outdo Scotty? You can't. So you have to come up with a new way to play the chief engineer. So O'Brien Cullen Meany somehow found a way to portray O'Brien in a new way. I just thought he was a character who I would say, if I was going to try to get away with a funny moment, it would have been him, because he's kind of got that persona, even if they don't always let it out in the show. He's kind of got a persona of a funny guy. So I would say Chief O'Brien. My second favorite, I have to get this in there, is Morn, and I can tell you the story of Morn later on when we're looking for new questions, I guess.
Sure. In a show like this, did you have to return the characters to their status quo at the end, because it's
Yes.
a series that's meant to be seen out of order?
Yeah,
So
well, to a certain extent. Let me qualify that, because another one of the episodes I did, and this was one where I only sold the story. They wrote one of their producers wrote the script, and this was the one story I pitched in which I actually contributed to the seasonal story arc for Deep Space Nine. And this is back in the days when very few TV shows did a seasonal story arc. Okay, Deep Space Nine was one of the few at that time that would do this. It was still pretty radical and experimental at that time. So I sold a story called For the Cause, and the setup of the story is they had this ongoing story arc in Deep Space Nine about it was an allegory for peace in the Middle East. Basically, you had two alien races representing the Israelis and the Palestinians fighting over their homeland, and there were some Starfleet, of course. Starfleet are the good guys of Star Trek. They're the people who I don't want to say patrol the galaxy, but they're sort of the peacekeepers in the galaxy. So Starfleet gets involved in this fight between these two alien races, and some Starfleet members basically mutiny and join one of these alien races, aka the Palestinians in this allegory here. So this story I pitched had, by this time Sisko had a girlfriend, Cassidy, and she was a freighter pilot. So I pitched a story where Sisko finds out that his girlfriend, Cassidy, is smuggling supplies to these insurgents, and that is against the law. So I pitched a story where the commander finds out that the woman he loves is breaking the law, and it's his duty to arrest her and bring her to justice. And they loved that idea, and it did a lot to alter that story arc. And the reason I really wish I could have written this script. They didn't hire me to write the script because it altered the seasonal story arc so much. They needed to make sure that it was handled just right. So their writer, I think in this case, I can't remember which one of them it was. But at any rate, so in a sense, I shot myself in the foot, because I got to contribute to a seasonal story arc. I got to influence it to a certain degree, but because I was influencing it, they didn't want me writing the script because it was just too touchy.
Now that's the one that you based a little bit on the Oklahoma City bombings.
Yes, yeah. It's basically how, because Oklahoma City bombings, which I think we just passed the 25th anniversary of.
Exactly.
I was very struck by the news. Everybody just assumed it was a foreign terrorist. It was somebody from another country, and it was such a shock to find out. No, it was like this guy from Oklahoma. It was an ordinary American dude who did this. Well, not ordinary. So yeah, that influenced the storytelling as well. Just this whole idea of, what if you find out that the worst criminal is like living right next to you, right under your nose.
Let's look at that trailer real quick.
Desperate terrorists begin their final assault.
They should be hunted down and destroyed.
But the real threat could be closer to home.
Cassidy Yates. Cassidy? Working for the Maquis? That's impossible.
Now caught between desire.
Miss me?
And duty.
Everything's been building to this.
Is Sisko sleeping with the enemy?
I need to know what your orders were.
Next time on Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
I guess that's why I asked if it was a 22 episode season, because that sure does sound like a end of season like punch.
Can we?
Oh, go ahead, Lance.
Well, I was wondering if we could talk about that just a little bit more, because one of the things that Star Trek does great is take current events and work them into sci-fi, and they can sort of disguise them. Like when Law and Order takes on a current event, it's very obvious what story is being told on Law and Order this week.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more subtle in Star Trek and sci-fi, and I'm wondering how much do you guys talk about those current events, and how do you like sort of disguise it or flip it on its head? You know, can you talk about that process at all?
I don't remember there ever being any real process along those lines. This is just an incidental fact, but the first time I went out to California to work with the producers on Second Sight, that was the week of the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. So I'm in Los Angeles, and the city is being torn apart by racial violence. So that was kind of an odd experience, but I don't remember there ever being any like talk about, well, let's see how we can make this story fit into modern times. It was at least in the case of my episode, For the Cause, it was more of an organic thing. It was just sort of one of the processes I go through in thinking of a story is I'll take a beloved character, and I just start thinking, what would be the worst possible situation I could put this character in? How could I put this character through an emotional ringer in 60 minutes? That's how my storytelling for Star Trek, at least, always worked. So I think so for me, it wasn't so much the idea that, I was playing off of current events. It was more a case of, how can I put the squeeze on this character and just put him in an incredibly difficult and even impossible situation? How would he react? And then in thinking along those lines, then I start thinking about, well, what is this situation that he's caught up in that's the source of this drama? So for me, at least for that episode, the tie-in with current events sort of came in through the back door.
Cool. So to that end, Josiah is asking, obviously that's one that's got a potentially sensitive theme. How do you write a theme without being too on the nose about it?
Oh, that's a really good question. Boy, I'm not sure if I have a really good answer to that really good question, to be honest. I mean, it's tricky. What I can tell you is that there were times when I would, when I'd be back home in Wisconsin using up my 2 weeks writing my script, when I would call one of the producers back in LA and say, I'm not sure how to pursue this. I'm not sure how to portray this. What can I do? They were always there to give advice about how to basically write something that's new and unique, and is dramatic and addresses the issues in the story, but also is not like overdoing it or stepping out of bounds somehow. So I guess my answer to that would be I depended on the producers to give me guidance in those situations.
They set the tone for that. How many steps of approval do you think it took? I mean, obviously, things left your hand, disappeared for days or weeks, and then somebody said, okay, go. Do you know how many steps of approval an idea would have to pass through in a show like that?
You mean for a completed script that I would submit?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would always be paired with not with the showrunner, but with one of the staff writers. So I'd be paired with Renee Echeverria, or I'd be paired with Brandon Braga, and that producer would be sort of my mentor while I was working on that particular script. So when I finished the script, first it would go to that person, and then it would circulate among the writing staff and go to the showrunner, which in this case was Ira Stephen Bear. But he wasn't the final call. Then it would go to the real showrunner, Michael Pillar. So that was the power structure. So there were the staff writers, there was Ira Bear, there was Michael Pillar, and then way at the top was Rick Berman, who basically inherited Star Trek from Gene Roddenberry. And I don't know that my scripts ever made it all the way to Rick Berman. I never heard any feedback from him. I only knew, I would get feedback from Mike Pillar. So it seemed to me that he was the final step on the chain. So that gives us like 3 levels of approval once the script is turned in.
A friend of mine did a show for Amazon, and one of their people ended up in an office with Jeff Bezos. So there's a way to get to the top.
Wow.
I don't know. It's got to be weird. So this is the mid-'90s. were you delivering it? Were you FedExing paper? Is that how everybody got
Yeah.
your script? Or
I'm pretty sure that's how we did it. Lots of big express postage packages being sent back and forth. Yeah, it was a crazy time.
When did you get your first computer for doing this kind of stuff?
Oh boy. Well, there's when I got my first computer, and then there's when I got my first computer that was actually capable of word processing.
Yep.
You know,
big difference.
and I really couldn't tell you. That's been so.
Did you have to send them a floppy as well?
I don't remember. I don't think
question.
so. That is a very good question. The technology has changed so much.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So you always loved sci-fi. At what age did you become aware of it, and what were the things that sent you in that direction? Because you've been in that direction ever since.
Yeah. What got me going in that direction is my first conscious memory. This would have been about 1963, so I would have been an adorable little 3-year-old boy, and I remember watching TV with my mom, and this new TV show came on called The Outer Limits. And it was a science fiction anthology show. So different story, different characters every week, completely new deal every episode. And so I'm sitting there with my mom. Somehow or other, my mom left TV tuned to this terrifying show, and it was the pilot episode. It was the very first episode, and it involved a radio engineer who makes contact with an alien from somewhere out there in the Andromeda galaxy, and through a weird fluke in his radio transmission equipment, the alien ends up getting teleported to Earth, and what first appears to be going on a rampage. The alien is sort of wandering around this town, destroying everything it comes across, but it's not trying to destroy anything. But you don't know that. So all I remember as a 3-year-old is just being scared to death. I remember I ran upstairs and I hid behind a corner, and I told my mom to tell me when the monster went away, and I would not come back down to the rec room until the monster went away, until my mom could assure me. So that's what ignited my love of science fiction. A terrifying experience. I don't know why, but that's what happened.
Well, the first 30 seconds of that show is enough to send chills up the spine. I remember.
What happened, though, was years and years later. So this is back in the 1960s. Outer Limits ran like a season and a half, and then it just disappeared. You just never saw that show again, because that's what happened back then. Shows just disappeared. You never saw them again. Unless they had gone 3 seasons, then maybe they would be picked up for reruns for something. But the Outer Limits never got picked up for reruns until I was in college. And then TNT, which I don't know if the TNT station, I don't think they're even still around anymore. But they started showing original Outer Limits episodes like overnight on Friday and Saturday nights. And I started watching those shows again, and I was blown away, because all I ever remembered from that show as a kid was the terrifying monsters. That's how I engaged with the show. I engaged with, the emotional end of it, the scariness, the suspense. But then I started watching the episodes again in college, and I realized, whoa, there's a lot more going on here than I thought. I really started to realize that the monsters in many of the episodes were more humane than the human beings, than the human characters. And when I started seeing that kind of opened my eyes to what you could do as a writer. Like, whoa, you can tell 2 different stories at the same time. How cool is that? So that's kind of what triggered me to really want to be a writer.
Torch. Yeah, 60s 60s sci-fi stuff was a high point for sure.
Can I backtrack to Deep Space Nine, though?
Oh yeah.
Because there's a story I want to tell that I think your students will appreciate. Because this is all about how to pitch. Right. So you saw the trailer for Who Mourns for Morn. You saw that guy who looks like he's a human hippopotamus, right? That was Morn. Morn hung around at Quark's bar every episode, and they named him Morn because it was a play on the name Norm from Cheers, which was a sitcom about people who hung out at this bar in Boston named Cheers. So Deep Space Nine had its own barfly, this hippopotamus man named Morn, who was always sitting at the bar drinking, never spoke a word, And there's a reason why he never spoke a word. It's because the prosthetic mask they made for him didn't have an articulated jaw. So for Morn to ever speak dialogue, they would have had to build a new facial piece with an articulated jaw. That would have cost money. There's no way they're ever going to do that. Plus, they would have had to pay the actor a lot more money to speak lines than to just be an extra. So I knew, after 6 years of working with these guys, I knew two things. I knew that people were constantly pitching Morn stories, and they were constantly getting swatted down because people would always pitch stories where Morn had to speak, and it was just never going to happen. Morn is never going to speak. Give it up. So I had a great idea. I pitched a story that was Citizen Kane in outer space, where Morn dies in the very first scene in the trailer. Morn dies without saying a word. And then for the rest of the episode, Quark, who was, of course, the comic relief, Quark would become the reporter from Citizen Kane, trying to find out. He realizes that he actually knew nothing about Morn, who he always considered his best friend. So in my story, Quark spent the episode sort of digging into Morn's past and found out that he was like Emperor of the Galaxy, and he had some vast fortune, and so Quark gets drawn into this crazy world that he never even knew existed. And they bought the story, but when they and the beauty of it was, obviously, Morn wasn't in the show. It was a Morn story without Morn, because he was dead. So there was no worry about the face mask or the speaking dialogue or anything. So I pitched it to them as basically a Citizen Kane in outer space. And if any of you students don't know what I'm referring to, shame on you. You should know this.
Fix that. Yeah.
So I pitched it as Citizen Kane on Deep Space Nine. And Ira Bear, the showrunner, came back to me and he said, "We love the story. We want to do it, but it's not going to be Citizen Kane. It's going to be Charade. We're going to do Charade in outer space." So if any of you don't know who Charade is, what Charade is, it was a very classy crime romp comedy made in probably the late 1960s with Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn. And in the movie Charade, the movie begins with the death of Audrey Hepburn's husband. So she goes to his funeral, she mourns his loss, and then all of a sudden, all of these really strange, creepy people start entering her life, and she eventually, including Cary Grant, and she eventually realizes that her husband was a crook, and he and his gang had pulled off this huge ripoff, this huge robbery, shortly before the husband died, but none of his partners knew where he hid the loot, and they all think that Audrey Hepburn knows where the loot is hidden. So all of these crooks and assassins are like descending on Audrey Hepburn's character, trying to figure out, threatening her with death unless she tells them where the stolen loot is. So that was the story they wanted to do with Who Mourns for Morn. And, so they sent me home with so I came out there thinking I'm doing Citizen Kane. I come back home 4 days later knowing that, no, I'm not doing Citizen Kane, I'm doing Charade, and I better make it work. Well, it turns out I did make it work. I had a ton of fun writing the script. Like I said, I was able to give everybody some funny, or just about everybody, some good funny moments, because it really was just a romp. It was just a crime romp of an episode. And it all went really well. I love how the episode turned out. The whole process of making it was really, really fun. So the point is, if you're going to pitch a story that if you got a character like Morn that is everybody loves and everybody wants to see that person in a story, you should go for it. But try to find some way to approach that character that nobody has ever thought of before. And then don't be afraid to break the rules and write this as a comedy. Because like I said, they never did comedies, or if they did, it was something the executive producer would hang on to himself and not let anyone else touch. So I always consider that kind of a major triumph in the world of Star Trek, that I was able to get the comedy done, and I was able to do the one and only Morn story.
I don't know. I think a true triumph would have been him coming in and saying, "Evening, everybody."
That would have been great. That would have been great.
Yeah, well, in the redo, perhaps. Should we wrap up? Because you have some feature projects you've
Not feature
developed over
projects.
time.
Well, I'll just give you the quick rundown. So since Star Trek, so that was end of the 90s when I was still working for them. I was living in Wisconsin, of course, raising a family. I would talk to my agent a lot about moving to LA to pursue a career as a TV writer based on my Star Trek work. And it just, at some point, I realized it's just not going to happen. There were things going on family-wise, personal-wise, making a move to LA at that point just not realistic. So instead, I told my agent, well, why don't I concentrate on feature scripts instead? Because I don't have to be living in LA to write feature scripts or to sell feature scripts. And he was all behind that. So I started doing that. And from about 1999 to about 2008, I didn't get any of my features produced, but I had a pretty consistent record of having my movie scripts optioned and put in development. At one point in 2006, I had one script that was ready. It was going to go into production with the late Bill Paxton directing it. But it never got off the ground because Bill Paxton's his second movie as director, The Greatest Game Ever Played, he made for Disney. And he wanted to make my script for Disney because he said he kept telling me, look, Mark, Disney loves me. My stock is so high with Disney right now. I can do anything I want as my follow-up, and I want to do your movie. So for like 6 months there, things were looking really great. But then The Greatest Game Ever Played came out. It was a golf movie that he had made with a very young Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah, it's kind of a great movie.
And the movie bombed. It bombed horribly. And then Bill got on a talk show on ESPN and started bad-mouthing the Disney publicity department for killing his movie, and that ended Bill's relationship with Disney, so my movie never got made. So I did a lot of that. In about 2011, started working on this book, had that published in 2017, and now, based in a very convoluted way, based in part on that book, I'm in production right now for a UFO show that's going to be on the Travel Channel sometime this summer. And I just signed 2 contracts last week to develop 2 new paranormal shows. Just development; they're not sold yet, so we don't know if they'll get picked up by anybody at this point. But the hope is that we can get something maybe placed at maybe Netflix is what we're shooting for. So that's my career in a nutshell right now.
Well, I think I read something this week that said that it's going to explode when everything gets back.
Yes.
And they're going to be just devouring everything in their path. So.
Yes. So. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because it is a really, really good time for a writer right now because nothing is in production, but everything is in development. People are coming up with projects right and left, and you're right. As soon as the economy gets back going again and production is allowed to continue, boom, there's going to be so much production going on, and there's going to be an unbelievable appetite for ideas and scripts.
Were those feature pitches fantasy, sci-fi stuff as well?
Most of them were. One of them, the feature script that really got almost the most attention was just a straight thriller about a cave rescue. I had been in LA working for Star Trek, and I went to a movie with a friend of mine while I was in town. We went to see Speed 2. Do you remember Speed 2? Okay,
That's
Speed,
the boat, right?
The original Speed worked because you're in a bus that's careening along at like 55 miles an hour. Speed 2, you're in an ocean liner that's going like 3 miles an hour. So to call it Speed anything is kind of a misnomer. I just remember my friend and I walked out of that movie thinking, oh my God, if you don't have the right setting for an action movie, you're dead. So I just started thinking, well, what's a good setting for an action movie that I've never seen? And I thought, a cave rescue. So I wrote this script about a cave rescue, and that script actually came pretty close to going into development at Al Ruddy Productions. Al Ruddy did the Godfather movies. But that script, this is also one of my favorite stories, that script got killed by Chuck Norris. Because
He kicked it, right?
because at the time, a roundhouse kick right through my script. At the time, Al Ruddy Productions was making this dopey TV series, Walker, Texas Ranger, starring Chuck Norris, and they had also started up a follow-up show that came on right after Walker on Saturday nights on CBS called Martial Arts. So Al Ruddy was basically providing all of CBS's Saturday night programming, and one day Al woke up and thought, why am I making movies? this TV stuff is just a license to print money. So he went into the office that day and was like, all the movies we're working on, throw them out. We're not doing that anymore. So that's how Chuck Norris killed my script.
Jeez, Chuck.
Yeah. That's Hollyweird.
It is. So these new shows, UFO content is a big thing that you've been working on. You've been running that blog for, is it about 10 years now?
Yeah, I started around 2011, High Strangeness. You can see it at highstrangenessufo.com. Yeah, I've been working that since about 2011. I spent about 5 years as a volunteer UFO field investigator for this group called MUFON. And then in the course of that work and the course of writing that blog, I got the opportunity to write a book, the biography of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who is being portrayed right now in the History Channel series Project Blue Book. But that is all made up. There's absolutely no truth to that story.
Yeah, speaking of the History Channel, when did they change to somebody else's History Channel? Anyway.
Well, I can tell you, I know you need to wrap up, and this is kind of a long story, but I have a funny story about that if you want to hear it.
I think we can take it.
All right.
I should say that we're all three slightly UFO folks. Lance has done some things.
Slightly.
I would like to think I was a member of that community in that I saw stuff as a kid and believe. And when did you get interested in that, Mark? At what age?
Well, I told you, at age 3 when I saw that scene from The Outer Limits.
Sure.
But also, my mom was a librarian in the small town in Wisconsin where I grew up, and she would always take me into the library with her, and I would always gravitate towards. There was one bookshelf that had books about UFOs and Bigfoot and poltergeists and the Bermuda Triangle, and I would always go to that bookshelf and just grab whatever they had and just read. I was just glued to that stuff. I loved it. So that's how that all got started.
Yeah, awesome. All right, let's hear the story. Go ahead.
So the History Channel. So right at 2 weeks before my book was published, History Channel announces that they're going to make a TV series about Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the guy I wrote my book about, and his work for the U.S. Air Force on what was called Project Blue Book, which was the Air Force's official study of the UFO phenomenon. Well, I went into a panic because I thought they must have gotten a copy of my book somehow and they're going to plagiarize it. So my attorney and I were really up in arms about this. And we were in communication with the show's producers, and they said, no, don't worry. We've come up with our own dramatic approach that we're much happier with. So the show premieres about a year and a half ago on History Channel. And it's awful to me because I just spent 6-7 years writing the true story of this man's work, and this show comes along and makes up everything, and that's what people are going to remember. So I was very upset about it. So I started writing bad things about the show in my blog, and suddenly I get an email from this guy who is the vice president of scripted TV for A&E Networks, and he's not happy with what I've been saying about his show, and he wants to talk to me. So I talk on the phone with this guy. I won't mention his name, but I talk on the phone with this guy. And he's telling me that it's really not fair for me to be bad-mouthing his TV show. And my response was, it's a free country. I can say whatever I want about your TV show, just like anybody else can. So what are you talking about? And he just sort of was like, well, you're hurting our feelings and blah, blah, blah. And I said, look, let me tell you what has happened. I said, ever since your show premiered, by this time the show had been on maybe 4 episodes. I said, ever since your show premiered, I've been getting endless phone calls and emails and text messages from friends and family and colleagues saying, hey, I saw that new Blue Book show on History Channel. Is that your show? Do you have anything to do with that? And I just wanted to tear my hair out. I was like, no, I have nothing to do with that show. That show is crap. They tried to turn it into a cheap X-Files ripoff, which if you can pull it off would be great, but I didn't think they were pulling it off. So I told this guy this story about how people kept calling me up and saying, is that your show? And I said, listen, I got to tell you, it really gets old after a while. And he got he ended up apologizing to me. He was like, oh, Mark, I had no idea. I didn't even consider that. He said, I'm really, really sorry. And I said, I saw an opening and I said, well, look, you can make it up to me I said, I teach a TV script writing class at DePaul University. I said, would you be willing to, call in some night and talk to my students? And he said, sure, I'd love to. So that's how we ironed it all out. So he did a thing with my class very similar to what we're doing here, And when I opened it up for questions from the students, the one question my students all wanted to answer was, at what point have you changed a story enough that you can no longer say based on a true story? How much can you change the fact? How much can you change the facts? It is a good question. I was so proud of my students for asking that. And that's like the number one question everybody had. You know, at what point can you no longer say based on a true story or based on actual events? So, and he had a very, very glib answer. He said, well, at the History Channel, he said, we're very keyed into the details. We want to get all the details right. But, he said, we don't pay so much attention to the micro details. We don't really care about getting the micro details right, because that's when you start, like, it makes it harder and harder to tell your story. So basically he was saying, you know, we kind of go with half truths, and we're comfortable with that. And so eventually he gets off the phone, and I asked my students, well, what'd you think? And they were all kind of like, what the hell was he talking about? Nobody even knew what he was trying to say, because he was being so careful about the way he said it, and it just ended up sounding like complete bull to all of us in my classroom. So that's my History Channel story.
Well, boy, keeping television interesting is one of the reasons we're all in the state that we're in now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good God. Lance, do you have any parting questions for Mark?
No, I think we covered everything very, very well. This has been fantastic.
I agree. Jason Thomas on Facebook says, have you been to UFO Days in Campbellsport, Wisconsin?
No, but you're not the first person who's asked me that.
Yeah.
You know, Campbellsport is only one of, we also have a town here in southwestern Wisconsin, Evansville, I believe, which also calls itself the UFO capital of Wisconsin. Also Manitowoc, they don't quite call themselves UFO capital of Wisconsin, but they had a piece of a Sputnik satellite crash land in the middle of their main street back in the early 60s. So that's their claim to fame. So there are a lot of towns out there that say they're the UFO capital, but no, I've never been to that.
That's all right. Have you seen something yourself?
Have I?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry to say. I've seen things that at first I thought were UFOs, but on second thought realized they were most likely Chinese lanterns. A lot of people do that Chinese lantern stuff trying to fool people, and I've been fooled by it.
How about you, Lance? Ever see a thing?
Yes, it was quite strange, but that wasn't my interest. My dad was in the Air Force, and he always told the story about the strange things that would disappear off his radar screen, and he knew the government was covering it up.
Yeah.
That's cool
Hooked
stuff.
for sure.
Yep.
Well, that sounds like a cue to keep a close eye on all the things that are coming out from Mark this year and more. We hope for you. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Great question.
Super time.
I'm sorry.
And we'll catch up with you guys soon. Thanks,
Okay,
Mark.
I was just going to say, you know, you have my email address. If any of your students want to shoot me an email or something with a question, I'd be happy to talk to them. So.
That's good. I might hit you up again if I review the tape and realize that there were many things that slipped my mind as I'm also running the TV station over here. But it was great talking to you guys. We'll catch you guys soon.
Great questions from the students. Thank you.
Yeah,
yes,
sure.
absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
All right, guys. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
So one real quick thing before we close up shop here is that on Thursday, that's 2 days from now, we're going to have Charles Hubble in the house talking about acting at the indie level, which should be very exciting because he's had decades now of experience at all sorts of budget levels and has worked opposite some rather big names, and I'm sure he's going to have some stories about that kind of stuff when we talk to him on Thursday. That's 6 p.m. Central. And thanks for all joining us tonight, and I'm going to end with a quick pitch for the live Dude We Do with Video Vinny here. Let's go take a look at that.
Stuck at home with nothing but a fantastic internet connection and a couple of major streaming services? Want to recreate the experience of hitting up a local video rental store for a couple of VHS tapes just like in the 80s and 90s? Well, look no further than Big Retro Video. Let Video Vinny be your guide as he points the way to retro video finds on Amazon, Netflix, YouTube, and more. It's Big Retro Video!
Right.